Security has a way of sounding absolute. Barbed wire, watchtowers, searchlights, guard dogs, forms stamped and filed. A prison camp is supposed to represent the end of movement, the end of options. Years later, reading RAF correspondence and post-war investigation files, I found the moment that certainty cracked. Not because of a new weapon, not because of sabotage on an industrial scale. The documents were almost mundane at first glance. I've listed the records below. What unsettled Berlin wasn't an army crossing a border. It was a handful of men deciding confinement was not the same as control. The reaction that followed revealed far more than the escape itself. Here is that story.
March 1944. A frozen corner of Silesia. A tunnel, dug in secret beneath a prisoner of war camp, opens into the night air. 76 Allied airmen crawl through the dark and vanish into Nazi Germany. Within days, Berlin responds. Not with tighter fences, not with new guards, not with transfers or solitary confinement. With an execution order. 50 of the recaptured prisoners are to be shot. Not criminals, not spies. Uniformed officers of the Royal Air Force and its allied services, protected under international law. How did a tunnel, dug with stolen bedboards and tin can air pumps, force Adolf Hitler to break the rules of war? The camp stood in a clearing carved from thick pine forest in Lower Silesia, near the town of Sagan. It was established in March 1942, roughly 100 miles southeast of Berlin. Its official designation was Stalag Luft III. In the bureaucratic shorthand of the Third Reich, the name meant little more than a numbered holding facility for captured enemy aircrew, but its purpose was specific, and its design was deliberate. It was a Luftwaffe-run prisoner-of-war camp that held captured Western Allied Air Force personnel, and every inch of it had been engineered to prevent one thing: escape. The site was selected because its sandy soil made it difficult for prisoners to escape by tunneling. The earth beneath the camp was a distinctive bright yellow, loose and collapsible, almost impossible to dig through without it caving in, and nearly impossible to conceal once removed. The barracks were raised approximately 60 centimeters off the ground to make it easier for guards to detect tunneling. Any fresh digging beneath the hut would be visible to the most casual inspection, but the Germans went further still. Seismograph microphones were sited around the perimeter of the camp to detect any sounds of digging. The ground itself had been turned into a listening device. There were watchtowers ringing the perimeter, manned day and night. A double barbed wire fence. Between the inner fence and the huts ran a warning wire, low to the ground, marking the line where a guard could shoot without hesitation. Beyond the wire, the pine forest pressed close, dark and uniform, offering nothing but distance to any man who somehow got past the fences. The nearest neutral border was hundreds of miles away. There were no friendly lines to reach, no partisan networks to rely on. Germany surrounded the camp in every direction, and the war still had years to run. At its peak, the camp held almost 11,000 Commonwealth and American enlisted men and officers in several compounds, across a 60-acre site, overseen by 800 guards. The camp was known for being more comfortable than many, with generally good relations between the guards and the prisoners. Compounds were allowed a sports field, and the camp had a well-stocked library and even a prisoner orchestra. There were cooking privileges. Red Cross parcels arrived with some regularity, bringing chocolate, powdered milk, soap, and cigarettes that functioned as currency. Officers were not forced to work, in keeping with the Geneva Convention. The Luftwaffe, which administered the camp, regarded itself as a professional branch of the military, and its officers extended a certain correctness toward the men in their charge. This was not kindness. It was control. The original commandant was an old-school aristocrat with some 40 years of army service, courteous and considerate at first sight, but inclined to fits of uncontrolled rage. He understood something that the architecture of the camp was designed to enforce. Escape was not merely a logistical problem, it was a psychological one. A man who believed he could not get out would eventually stop trying. If the camp was comfortable enough to tolerate and secure enough to make any attempt seem futile, the prisoners would settle into the long, gray rhythm of captivity. They would read, they would garden, they would study languages and stage amateur theater and slowly, day by day, forget that they were soldiers. That was the theory. In response to persistent escapes from other facilities, Germany built a number of escape-proof prisoner camps. Stalag Luft III was meant to be the finest of them, the culmination of lessons learned from every tunnel discovered, every fence cut, every forged pass exposed. The men inside were considered the most dangerous escape risks in the system, transferred here specifically because they had already tried to break out of other camps. They were here because they had proven they would not stop. The Germans looked at their camp and saw a masterpiece of prevention. The sand was too bright to hide. The huts were too exposed to dig beneath. The microphones would catch any sound below the surface. The perimeter was too deep, the guards too many, the forest too wide. They believed they had thought of everything. They had not accounted for what happens when you put 600 restless, disciplined, highly trained officers together and give them nothing to do but think. Subscribe if you want more hidden WWII histories told carefully. Among the men transferred into the north compound of Stalag Luft III in the autumn of 1942 was a South African-born RAF officer, whose quiet intensity set him apart. Squadron leader Roger Joyce Bushell had been born in Springs, Transvaal, in August 1910. He had studied law at Cambridge, excelled at rugby and skiing, and joined the Royal Air Force in 1932. A former squadron commander shot down during the Battle of Dunkirk in May 1940. He believed that every captured officer had a moral duty to attempt to escape. By the time he arrived at Sagan, Bushell had already tried twice. Over the previous years, he had come within 100 yards of the Swiss border during his first attempt, and his second escape had taken him to Prague, where he was sheltered by the Czech resistance for 8 months before he was captured. Eventually betrayed, he and his hosts were arrested by the Gestapo. The family that had sheltered them was executed. The Gestapo suspected he might have been involved in the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, and he endured relentless interrogation. This only deepened Bushell's hatred of the Nazis. He arrived at Stalag Luft III not as a man resigned to captivity, but as one sharpened by it. He carried scars the Germans could not see, and he carried a plan that no one inside the wire had ever attempted on this scale. At Stalag Luft III, Bushell took over control of the escape organization and, known as Big X, masterminded the building of 3 tunnels known as Tom, Dick, and Harry, the production of escape material, the introduction of layers of security, and the gathering of military intelligence. The escape committee he inherited was already sophisticated, staffed by men who had been thinking about getting out since the day they arrived. But Bushell transformed it. He did not want a few men slipping through the wire in the night. He wanted an industrial operation. The most radical aspect of the plan was not merely the scale of the construction, but also the sheer number of men that Bushell intended to pass through these tunnels. Previous attempts had involved the escape of anything up to 20 men, but Bushell was proposing to get over 200 out, each wearing civilian clothes and possessing a complete range of forged papers and escape equipment. It was an unprecedented undertaking which would require unparalleled organization. Bushell aimed to obstruct Germany's war effort through a mass escape and the inevitable disorder that efforts to recapture the escapees would generate. The goal was not simply freedom. Most of the men knew their chances of reaching a neutral country were slim. The real weapon was disruption. 200 men loose inside the Reich, carrying forged documents, wearing civilian clothes, speaking German and French and Norwegian and Dutch, scattering across the rail network and the highways. Every one of them would require police to track, soldiers to hunt, resources to process. The manhunt alone would tie down thousands. 3 tunnels would be dug simultaneously. If one was found, the Germans would celebrate and perhaps relax their vigilance, never imagining that 2 more were already underway. In 1943, under Bushell's leadership, the prisoners started digging 3 large tunnels known as Tom, Dick, and Harry, all emanating from huts in the compound. The tunnels were 30 feet deep in an attempt to avoid German detection, and were designed to run more than 300 feet into woods outside the camp. The word tunnel was forbidden. Anyone who used it risked being cut from the operation entirely. The code names were all that mattered. Tom, Dick, Harry. One would succeed, that was all Bushell needed. And the tools at his disposal were absurd. No drill bits, no hydraulic jacks, no surveying equipment. Stolen kitchen knives, sharpened tin lids, candle stubs for light, blankets for bags. The men would dig with their hands when they had to. They would breathe recycled air pushed through tin cans soldered together with fat and wax. They would lie flat on wooden trolleys pulled by ropes through passages 2 feet square, 30 feet underground, in collapsing sand in the dark. It was not a bomb. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was dirt and discipline, ingenuity and rage, and the absolute refusal of 600 imprisoned officers to accept that their war was over. The engineering challenge was staggering. Every tunnel had to begin inside a hut, beneath something permanent enough to conceal the entrance. Tom began in a darkened corner of a hall in one of the buildings. Harry's entrance was hidden under a stove. The stove sat on a concrete and tile base that extended from the hut floor to the ground. Breaking through that base took hours of painstaking work with improvised picks, and when the work was done, the entrance had to be sealed and recamouflaged so perfectly that even a suspicious guard running his hands over the surface would find nothing. Each tunnel dropped straight down a shaft roughly 30 feet deep. That depth was critical. The tunnels were 30 feet below the surface to avoid the digging sounds being picked up by the microphones. At the bottom of each shaft, the men hollowed out small chambers that served multiple purposes. They installed bellows-style air pumps, which had been built in secret and smuggled down into the tunnels. Drawing from a disused chimney above, the contraptions supplied ventilation along pipelines imaginatively strung together from old Klim powdered milk tins. Down in that same area, the men added workshop spaces used for building the timber supports for the tunnel, as well as the wooden tracks and trolleys of rudimentary railways. The ventilation system alone was a marvel of improvisation. Hundreds of empty dried milk tins, tops and bottoms removed, fitted end to end and sealed with melted wax or tape. This fragile pipeline ran the full length of each tunnel, carrying air pumped by hand-operated bellows fashioned from kit bags and wooden frames. A man sat at the bellows for hours, pushing and pulling, sending stale air out and drawing fresh air in. Without him, the digger at the face would suffocate. Running on flanged wheels, the trolley carts were designed to get men, tools, and debris back and forth along the tunnel in a fraction of the time it would take to crawl. In Harry's instance, the railway system eventually comprised 3 sections, and passengers had to swap trolleys twice to complete the full journey. A man would lie flat on the wooden trolley, gripping a rope, and be pulled forward through a passage barely large enough to contain his body. The sand pressed against his shoulders. The ceiling hung inches from his face. The air was thin and warm, and smelled of earth and sweat and burning fat. If the tunnel collapsed, he would be buried alive with no one able to reach him. Above ground, the operation was equally intricate. The dapper Rhodesian Johnny Travis and his team of manufacturers made escape equipment, such as compasses from fragments of broken Bakelite gramophone records, melted and shaped and incorporating a tiny needle made from slivers of magnetized razor blades. Each compass was small enough to hide in a pocket, accurate enough to guide a man through open country at night. The team even stamped them on the underside with a grim joke of provenance. Forgers worked in a hidden workshop, copying German identity documents with extraordinary precision. By bribing guards with Red Cross goods unavailable in Germany, such as chocolate, coffee, soap, and sugar, prisoners obtained cameras and travel documents that a team of artists used to forge identity cards, passports, and travel passes. They replicated travel stamps by carving patterns in boot heels and using shoe polish as ink. Tailors cut and stitched civilian clothing from blankets, uniforms, and scraps of fabric. A dark blanket, properly dyed and sewn, could pass for a German overcoat in poor light. RAF trousers could be reshaped into something approximating civilian wear. Buttons were repositioned. Labels were faked. Every escapee would need a complete outfit, and the tailors produced them one at a time, measuring each man, stitching by hand, hiding the garments in the tunnel storage chambers when they were done, and then there was the sand. Disposing of the sand was one of the biggest difficulties attached to the project. Men known as penguins would potter around the compound with makeshift bags full of sand stashed inside their trousers. Picking their moments, usually when passing the vegetable gardens where the earth was fresh, the men would release small amounts of debris using a drawstring and inconspicuously trample it in. The bright yellow tunnel sand had to disappear into the gray-brown surface soil without trace. Hundreds of men walked those circuits every day, scattering handfuls of evidence beneath their boots, while lookouts watched for guards with the careful choreography of a military operation. After the escape, the Germans were horrified to discover that 4,000 bedboards were missing and had been used to shore up the tunnels. Many other items had been used, including 90 complete bunk beds, 635 mattresses, 52 20-man tables, 10 single tables, 34 chairs, 76 benches, 69 lamps, 246 water cans, 30 shovels, 1,000 feet of electric wire, 600 feet of rope, and over 3,000 towels. An entire camp had been silently dismantled, piece by piece, and reassembled underground. The guards walked above it every day and saw nothing. In September 1943, the operation suffered its first serious blow. Tunnel, Tom was discovered just as it reached the woods. German security teams, the men the prisoners called ferrets, found the entrance and summoned photographers to document their triumph. The Nazis celebrated their discovery. However, they were unaware that work on the 2 other underground passages continued. The discovery of Tom was a calculated risk that Bushell had always anticipated. The simultaneous construction of 3 tunnels was designed precisely for this moment. The simultaneous digging of these tunnels would become an advantage if any one of them were discovered by the Germans, because the guards would scarcely imagine that another 2 could be well underway. The Germans had found one. They believed the problem was solved. They relaxed, fractionally, and that fraction was all the prisoners needed. But the setback carried real consequences. The ferrets intensified their searches. They probed the floors of huts with metal rods. They crawled beneath raised buildings with flashlights and mirrors. They watched the prisoners more closely, noting who walked where and when, looking for patterns that might betray a hidden entrance or a sand disposal route. The margin for error shrank. The prisoners eventually turned Dick into a storage space and focused all construction on Harry. Dick's planned exit point had been compromised when the Germans cleared the trees above it for a camp expansion. Rather than abandon the shaft entirely, the men converted it into a vast underground warehouse. As the tunnel's entrance was very well hidden, Dick was also used as a storage room for items such as maps, postage stamps, forged travel permits, compasses, and clothing. Everything the escapees would need was cached there, waiting. All efforts now converged on Harry, the single remaining tunnel, the last chance. The Germans were aware that something was going on but failed to discover any of the tunnels until much later. To break up an escape attempt, 19 of the top suspects were transferred without warning to another camp. Of those, only 6 had been involved with tunnel construction. One of these, a Canadian named Wally Floody, was actually originally in charge of digging and camouflage before his transfer. The loss of Floody was severe. He was the chief tunneling engineer, a pre-war mining man from Canada, who understood soil mechanics and shoring techniques in ways that no amount of improvisation could replace. Other key figures vanished with him. The Germans thought they were decapitating the escape organization. In truth, they were pruning branches while the root system remained intact. Bushel was still inside, the committee was still functioning, and Harry was still growing, foot by foot, in the dark beneath Hut 104. In spite of the setbacks, with their efforts and resources narrowed to just one tunnel, progress was much swifter, and by March they had dug beyond the compound, perimeter. Escape was now viable. The tunnel stretched over 300 feet. It had its own electric lighting, tapped from the camp's circuit board. It had a railway with 3 sections and 2 transfer points. It had ventilation running its full length. It had chambers named after London landmarks, Piccadilly Circus, and Leicester Square, where men could sit upright and catch their breath before continuing. And above it, every day, German guards walked their patrols and heard nothing. The tension in the north compound was unbearable. Hundreds of men knew the tunnel existed. Hundreds knew roughly where it was. Every one of them carried a secret that could get men killed. A single careless word, a single suspicious glance, a single guard who decided to probe a few inches deeper than usual, and everything would collapse. Not just the tunnel, the plan, the hope, the year of work, the lives of the men who would be caught inside the shaft when the Germans came. Bushel held it all, together through force of will and the discipline of the X-organization. But the strain showed in the way men moved, in the silences that fell when a guard passed too close, in the sleepless nights and the hollow eyes, and the quiet understanding that failure would not simply mean punishment. It would mean the end of everything they had built beneath the frozen ground. It was a moonless night, and it would be another month before the lunar cycle provided such favorable conditions again. It was only in the hours preceding the 24th of March, 1944, that Bushel made the decision to break the tunnel that coming night. The temperature outside was brutal. Late winter in Silesia. Snow still covered the ground, a detail that would matter enormously in the hours ahead. 200 men were selected to take part, and on the moonless night of the 24th of March, 1944, the escape began. Each man had a number, each had a set of forged papers, each had civilian clothing or disguise, each knew his route, his cover story, his destination. The first men in line were those judged to have the best language skills, the strongest chances of making it to a neutral border. The last slots were filled by lottery. Inside Hut 104, the stove was pulled aside and the entrance to Harry was opened. The trapdoor to Harry was frozen shut. It took them an hour and a half of precious time to get the damn thing open. The delay was agonizing. Every minute lost meant one fewer man who would make it through before dawn. When the hatch finally gave way, the first man descended into the shaft, 30 feet down, into the warm, stale air of the tunnel. He lay on the trolley and was pulled forward through 300 feet of cramped passage, past the junction points, past the electric lamps that threw weak pools of yellow light against the sand walls, past the air pipes that hummed with each push of the bellows far behind him. Around 10:30 that night, British bomber pilot Johnny Bull slowly traversed the tunnel more than 30 feet below the oblivious guards and peeked his head out of the snowy ground beyond the camp's fence. As he breathed in the glacial air and filled his lungs with freedom, the sweat-soaked prisoner discovered that the tunnel had stopped feet short of the protective cover of the forest. This was a crisis. The exit shaft had been calculated to emerge inside the tree line. Instead, it opened into a patch of open ground between the fence and the forest edge. Any man climbing out would be visible to the watchtower guards for several seconds. In the snow, he would leave tracks. The plan had assumed darkness and cover. Now there was darkness and exposure. The men at the tunnel mouth improvised. They strung a rope from the exit to the nearest trees. One man lay in the woods and tugged the rope when the guards in the nearest tower were looking the other direction. When the rope went taut, the next man climbed out, crossed the open ground in a low crouch, and disappeared into the pines. The system was painfully slow. Only one man every 6 minutes could escape, as opposed to the intended one every minute or two. Hour after hour, men emerged from the earth, one at a time, into the freezing night. They wore makeshift civilian clothes and carried small bundles. Some headed for the Sagan railway station on foot. Others struck out across country. Some traveled in pairs, others went alone. Each man vanishing into the darkness was a small miracle of preparation meeting luck. There were other delays, a partial collapse inside the tunnel that had to be repaired, an air raid that forced the camp into blackout and cut the tunnel's electric lighting. Men fumbling in total darkness, 30 feet underground, waiting for power to be restored. The clock running down with every stalled minute. By 5 in the morning, only 76 men had exited the tunnel, and the 77th was spotted by a German guard. 76 men escaped, but the 77th man was spotted and the alarm was raised. The guard had strayed from his regular path and noticed the dark hole in the snow. He followed the tracks. He found a man lying flat on the ground. The operation was over. Inside Hut 104, the controllers ordered the remaining men to destroy their forged papers, hide their civilian clothes, and return to their bunks. The hatch was sealed. Evidence was scattered. Men who had been minutes from freedom climbed back into their bunks and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of German boots and shouted orders, waiting for what would come next. 76 men were gone. They were somewhere out there in the frozen night, scattered across the roads and railways of the Third Reich. Some were already miles away. Some were huddled in ditches, waiting for trains. Some were walking through snow with compasses made from gramophone needles and maps drawn from memory. The tunnel had worked. The impossible had been achieved. But the night was not over, and neither was the war. And the men who had crawled through that tunnel had no way of knowing that the greatest danger they would face was not the cold, not the police, not the border patrols. It was a decision that had not yet been made, in a room they would never see, by a man whose rage would rewrite the rules of what could be done to a prisoner of war. News of the escape reached the highest levels of the German government with extraordinary speed. A few hours later, it was being discussed by Hitler and the German High Command. 76 men had vanished from a camp that was supposed to be inescapable. The number alone was staggering. This was not a lone officer slipping through the wire. This was an organized, industrial-scale breakout that had evaded every detection system the Germans had built. This was a nationwide hue and cry, meaning that every policeman and quasi-policeman in Germany and occupied Europe had the task of looking for the escaped officers, whose photographs were published in the German Police Gazette. The manhunt was enormous. The Germans mobilized a massive response. They erected roadblocks, increased border patrols, and searched hotels and farms. The scale of the response was itself a humiliation. Thousands of police and military personnel diverted from other duties. Train stations monitored. Border crossings reinforced. Every hotel register checked. Every suspicious traveler questioned. The resources pouring into the search were exactly what Bushel had predicted. The tunnel had not just released 76 men, it had consumed an entire security apparatus. At Berchtesgaden, the atmosphere was volcanic. The Führer demanded retribution. This was not merely a security failure, it was an affront. The escape proved that the prisoners had been running a sophisticated intelligence and engineering operation under German noses for months. The forged documents were nearly perfect. The civilian clothing was convincing. The tunnel was an engineering marvel, and no one in the camp's guard force had stopped it. The commandant of Stalag Luft III was immediately removed. After the British mass escape of March 1944, the commandant was replaced. The ferrets who had failed to find Harry were disgraced. The Gestapo descended on the camp and tore it apart, searching for any sign of further tunnels. What they found astonished them. The sheer volume of stolen and repurposed material. Thousands of bedboards, hundreds of mattresses, dozens of tables and chairs, all cannibalized for tunnel construction. An entire infrastructure had been built beneath their feet while they conducted daily inspections above. The embarrassment rippled outward. The Luftwaffe, which was responsible for the camp, faced questions about competence. The security services faced questions about their surveillance methods, and at the highest level, the escape became a symbol of something the regime could not afford: the appearance of losing control. For a government that depended on the projection of total authority, 76 men crawling through a hole in the ground was an unbearable embarrassment. It did not matter that most would likely be recaptured. What mattered was that they had gotten out at all. And the man responsible for the war, the man who had built his power on the promise of absolute dominance, was now being told that a group of imprisoned aviators had outsmarted his entire security state with bedboards and milk tins. That man wanted blood. The recapture began almost immediately. Most of the 76 men were on foot in a landscape that offered few advantages to a fugitive. The snow on the ground left tracks. The cold was savage. Many of the escapees had no real winter clothing, only their improvised civilian disguises, which were designed to pass a casual inspection in a train station, not withstand days of exposure. And every road, every bridge, every rail junction was now being watched. The escapees made their way to Sagan railway station, but in the darkness they could not find the entrance, and precious hours were wasted with many missing their trains. Eventually, in the early hours, they caught the first trains out of Sagan, or continued their journey on foot, but due to the delays, nearly all were eventually caught in the Sagan area. Some were arrested within hours, picked up at railway stations when their forged papers failed under close scrutiny. Others lasted a day or two, sleeping in barns or fields, moving, at night, trying to reach a border that seemed to recede with every step. A few made it farther, boarding trains and traveling hundreds of miles before a checkpoint. A suspicious conductor or an alert policeman brought them to a halt. Bushel was the fourth officer out of the tunnel and quickly made his way to Sagan railway station with his escape partner, Bernhard Schadhauer. The plan was to catch a train to Alsace, but on the 26th of March both were stopped and arrested at Saarbrücken station in western Germany, 500 miles from Stalag Luft III. 500 miles. Bushel had traveled 500 miles on forged papers, dressed as a civilian, speaking fluent German and French before the net closed. The distance itself was an indictment of the system that was supposed to prevent exactly this. Within 2 weeks, the Germans had recaptured 73 of the escapees. The efficiency of the manhunt was brutal. One by one, in train stations and hotels and roadside checkpoints, the men were taken back into custody. Some were treated correctly, processed through civilian police channels, and prepared for return to POW camps. Others were handed to the Gestapo for interrogation. The distinction between these two paths would prove to be the difference between life and death. Only 3 men successfully fled to safety. 2 Norwegians stowed away on a freighter to Sweden, and a Dutchman made it to Gibraltar by rail and foot. The 2 Norwegians, Bergsland and Müller, escaped together and reached neutral Sweden by train and boat with the help of friendly Swedish sailors. Van der Stock traveled through much of occupied Europe with the help of the French resistance before finding safety at a British consulate in Spain. 3 out of 76. It was a fraction that would haunt the story. 3 men free, 73 men back in German hands, and no one yet knew what those hands would do. The recaptured men were scattered across police stations, Gestapo, offices, and civilian jails in a wide arc around Sagan. Some were in Breslau, some in Görlitz, some as far as Saarbrücken or Munich or the Czech frontier. They were cold, exhausted, and in some cases injured, but they were alive. They were uniformed prisoners of war who had exercised what the Geneva Convention recognized as a legitimate act, the attempt to escape captivity. Under international law, the maximum punishment for an escape attempt was 28 days in solitary confinement. That was the rule. What they did not know, what none of them could have known, was that the rules had already ceased to matter. On the 26th of March, the news of the escape reached Hitler at Berchtesgaden, and after consultations with Göring, Keitel, and Himmler, he gave the verbal order that more than half of the escapees were to be shot. The sequence of this decision matters. It was not an outburst that faded. It was not a threat made in passing and then retracted. The day after the mass escape, Hitler gave personal orders that every recaptured officer was to be shot. Every single one. The commandant of the camp was to be shot. The architect who designed the compound was to be shot. The guards on duty were to be shot. This was the first impulse. Annihilation. Göring pointed out to Hitler that a massacre might bring about reprisals against German pilots in Allied hands. Hitler agreed, but insisted more than half were to be shot, eventually ordering Himmler to execute more than half of the escapees. Himmler fixed the total at 50. The negotiation, if it can be called that, reveals something essential. Senior German military leaders did not object to the killing on moral grounds. They objected on strategic grounds. German airmen were being held in British camps, and Britain was watching. If Germany executed uniformed POWs, Britain might retaliate. The objection was not about law or humanity. It was about reciprocity, about what might happen to their own men. And even that objection was only partially successful. Hitler did not rescind the order. He adjusted the number. More than half would die. Himmler settled on 50. The number was precise, not a battlefield decision, not a chaotic act of wartime violence, a calculated, bureaucratic determination, made in a conference room by senior officials who understood exactly what they were ordering. Keitel gave orders that the murdered officers were to be cremated and their ashes returned to the POW camp as a deterrent to further escapes. Himmler set up the logistics for actually killing the men and passed it down through his subordinates in the Gestapo. The general orders were that recaptured officers would be turned over to the criminal police, and 50 would be handed to the Gestapo to be killed. The mechanism was deliberate. The criminal police, the Kripo, would hold the recaptured men. 50 names would be selected. Those 50 would be transferred to the Gestapo, and the Gestapo would kill them. Not in a camp, not in a prison, on the road, in the countryside, in places where there would be no witnesses, no records, no accountability. The cremation order was equally calculated. Bodies leave evidence, ashes do not. By cremating the victims and returning the urns to Stalag Luft III, the regime intended both to destroy evidence and to send a message. The urns would sit in the camp where every prisoner could see them. 50 urns. 50 men who had tried to escape and been killed for it. The message was meant to be final. This is what happens. But the decision carried within it the seeds of its own exposure. The very precision that made the operation efficient also made it traceable. The teleprints, the transfer orders, the cremation records. The Gestapo's own bureaucracy, meticulous as always, would eventually become the evidence that convicted them. No one at the conference table in Berchtesgaden imagined they would ever have to answer for this decision. The war was still being fought. Germany still controlled most of Europe. Accountability was a concept for the defeated, and they did not yet believe they were defeated. That belief would prove to be the greatest miscalculation of all. The killing began within days. As the prisoners were recaptured, they were interrogated for any useful information and taken out by motor car, usually in small parties of 2 at a time, on the pretext of returning them to their prison camp. The method was consistent because it was ordered from the top. A teleprint had gone out from the Reich Security Main Office to Gestapo regional headquarters across Germany and occupied Europe. After interrogation, the officers would be transferred to their original camps and would be shot on the way. The reason for the shooting would be given as shot whilst trying to escape or shot whilst resisting, so that nothing could be proved at a future date. The cover story was built into the order itself. Before the first shot was fired, the official narrative had already been written. Every death would be recorded as an escape attempt during transport. The uniformity of the excuse was its most damning feature. 50 men, in different locations on different dates, all coincidentally tried to escape during a roadside stop, and all were coincidentally shot dead. No wounded, no survivors, just bodies. Their Gestapo escorts would stop them in the country and invite the officers to relieve themselves. The prisoners were then shot at close range from behind by pistol or machine pistol fire. The bodies were then left for retrieval, after which they were cremated and their ashes returned in urns to Stalag Luft III. The procedure was nearly identical each time. The recaptured officer would be told he was being driven back to Sagan. He would sit in the back of a car with 1 or 2 Gestapo agents. After some distance, the car would stop. The officer would be told he could stretch his legs or use the bushes. When he turned his back, the agent behind him would draw a pistol and fire. Some men were killed alone, others in pairs. Between the 29th of March and about the 13th of April, the selected 50 men were shot at. Locations across German-occupied Europe. Buschel and his escape partner Schadhauer were initially held in a civilian jail before the Gestapo took them for what it called political interrogation. Told that they would then be returned to Stalag Luft III. While traveling by car on the 29th of March, the journey was halted on the Autobahn outside Ramstein, Germany. Here, both men were murdered on the side of the road by the Gestapo officers escorting them. In the case of Buschel, his death certificate was typed out several days before his killing. The bureaucracy had already processed his death before his body had fallen. The paperwork preceded the murder. The system was that precise and that indifferent. The Breslau Gestapo murdered by far the largest number of recaptured men, at least 26, but more likely 29, roughly 3/5 of the total. But the killings were spread across the occupied territories. Munich, Danzig, Kiel, Brno. Wherever the escapees had been caught, the local Gestapo office received its instructions and carried them out. SS Gruppenführer Arthur Nebe, who is believed to have selected the airmen to be shot, was later executed by the Nazis for his involvement in the July plot to kill Hitler. The man who chose the names on the death list would himself die at the hands of the regime he served. But that irony offered no comfort to the 50 men who had been murdered on roadsides and in fields across the Reich. Their ashes were collected. Their urns were transported back to Stalag Luft III. And when the urns arrived, the remaining prisoners knew. They knew because the number was wrong. 50 dead, all supposedly shot while trying to escape. Not one wounded. Not one recaptured alive after the alleged second attempt. The uniformity of the outcome told the truth that the reports tried to hide. These men had not been killed in the chaos of flight. They had been executed. Deliberately, methodically, on orders. The urns sat in, the camp like accusations. And the men who had built the tunnel, who had sewn the clothes and forged the papers and pumped the bellows, looked at those urns and understood that the war had changed. Not on the battlefield, not in the air, but in the space between law and murder, where a regime that claimed to be civilized had crossed a line it could never uncross. Germany informed the British government of the deaths through official channels, and the explanation was exactly what the teleprint had prescribed. The 50 officers had been shot while attempting to escape during their return to captivity. It was presented as a series of unfortunate but lawful incidents. The men had resisted. The men had run. The guards had responded with force. Regrettable, but within the bounds of wartime necessity. The Germans were now in a sense fully aware that the explanation, that all 50 prisoners were shot dead and that none were reported as wounded while trying to escape, was unconvincing. The numbers destroyed the lie before it could take hold. 50 men, 50 dead, 0 wounded, 0 survivors, in separate incidents across multiple locations over a period of weeks. The statistical impossibility was its own testimony. Himmler had to provide an official excuse that the German Foreign Ministry could use in its dealings with the Swiss protecting power, which had been instructed to hold an official inquiry into the affair. It was therefore essential that statements, however false, should be issued. Gestapo head Müller issued orders for detailed reports to be made. The cover-up included returning to the murder scenes to fire shots into tree trunks and telegraph poles. Gestapo agents went back to the places where the officers had been killed and staged evidence. Bullet holes in wood, marks in the dirt, the theater of a struggle that never happened. Reports were drafted with careful attention to the physical details, each one describing a slightly different scenario, but arriving at the same conclusion. The prisoner had tried to escape. The guard had fired. The prisoner was dead. The Gestapo version of events read like a carbon copy, with each prisoner shot while attempting to escape during a rest stop. The language was almost identical from report to report. The geography changed. The names changed. But the narrative was the same, repeated 50 times with minor variations, as though someone had written a template and distributed it. Notices posted in Allied POW camps on the 23rd of July 1944 stated that escape from prison camps was no longer a sport. The notices were blunt and threatening. They were an attempt to formalize the new reality. Escape would no longer be treated as a recognized act of duty under the Geneva Convention. It would be treated as a capital offense. But the warning itself was an admission. If escape had always carried the risk of being shot, there would be no need for a new notice. The notice existed because something had changed, something that required an announcement. And that change was the murder of 50 men under circumstances so transparently false that even the perpetrators felt the need to restructure the rules retroactively. The Swiss protecting power, which served as a neutral intermediary between belligerent nations on matters of prisoner treatment, was not convinced. Britain was not convinced. And the men inside Stalag Luft III who had watched the urns arrive and read the notices on the walls, were not convinced either. The lie had been told, and it was already collapsing. The British government learned of the deaths from a routine visit to the camp by the Swiss authorities as the protecting power in May, and the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden announced the news to the House of Commons on the 19th of May 1944. Shortly after the announcement, the senior British officer of the camp, Group Captain Herbert Massey, was repatriated to England due to ill health. Upon his return, he informed the government about the circumstances of the escape and the reality of the murder of the recaptured escapees. Eden updated Parliament on the 23rd of June, promising that at the end of the war, those responsible would be brought to exemplary justice. The phrase carried weight. Exemplary justice. Not quiet diplomacy, not post-war amnesty, not a negotiated settlement. Justice that would serve as an example. The British government was placing a marker. The 50 names would not be forgotten. The circumstances of their deaths would not be filed away. Someone would answer for this. Inside the camps, the effect was searing. The men at Stalag Luft III knew the dead. They had shared huts with them. They had worked alongside them on the tunnel, forged documents beside them, rehearsed cover stories with them. The 50 were not abstractions. They were friends, bunkmates, fellow officers who had endured the same cold, the same boredom, the same longing for home. And now they were ashes in urns, lined up in a row, with a lie stamped on each official report. 73 officers were recaptured, and 50 of these were shot by the Gestapo in what was one of the greatest war crimes committed by Nazi Germany against British servicemen during the course of the Second World War. The surviving prisoners in the camp built a memorial. A memorial to the 50 was built in Sagan, near the site of Stalag Luft III. Stone and wood, and whatever materials they could gather, shaped into something that stood as both tribute and accusation. The Germans allowed it. Perhaps they understood that refusing would only deepen the fury. Perhaps they no longer cared. The memorial stood in the compound where every man could see it, a quiet reminder that this war had moved beyond anything the Geneva Convention had been written to contain. For Britain, the murders transformed the escape from a daring tactical operation into something far more potent, a moral cause. The tunnel itself became secondary. What mattered now was what had been done to the men who came out of it. The story was no longer about ingenuity, it was about murder. And murder demanded a reckoning. The names of the 50 were read aloud. They were printed in newspapers. They were spoken in Parliament. They were carried in the hearts of every officer still behind wire. A list of the dead that functioned as both grief and promise. The war was still being fought. D-Day was weeks away. And in the midst of the largest conflict in human history, the British government made a specific, personal, public commitment. The men who killed these 50 officers would be found, and they would pay. That promise would outlast the war itself. The German leadership had intended the killings to serve as deterrents. The urns returned to Stalag Luft III. The notices posted on camp walls. The implicit threat, try to escape and you will die. The calculation was straightforward. Fear would suppress resistance. The cost of escape had been raised from solitary confinement to summary execution. Surely no rational prisoner would risk it again. The calculation was wrong. The murders were a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, which protected the rights of prisoners of war. This response also quickly put a stop to all escape activity from POW camps in Europe, for fear that further reprisals would occur. On one level, then, the deterrence worked. Mass escape attempts were not repeated. The X-organization, or what remained of it, suspended major operations. The risk of triggering another massacre was too great. No one wanted to be responsible for sending more men to their deaths. But deterrence is not the same as submission. The prisoners did not become docile. They did not accept the legitimacy of the killings. They did not stop being soldiers. What changed was not their will, but their method. Resistance continued in subtler forms. Intelligence gathering continued. Coded letters continued to flow to London. The prisoners studied their guards, mapped their routines, catalogued weaknesses. They were still fighting. They were simply fighting in ways that did not invite another round of murders. And the psychological effect on the German side was not what the leadership had anticipated. The Luftwaffe officers who ran the camp were appalled. Many of them had adhered to the Geneva Convention throughout the war, maintaining a professional relationship with their prisoners, even a grudging mutual respect. The Gestapo murders destroyed that relationship. The guards knew the truth. They knew the 50 men had not been shot while escaping. They knew the urns contained evidence of a crime committed by their own government. And they knew that when the war ended, there would be consequences. For the German guards at Stalag Luft III, the murders created a new and uncomfortable awareness. They were no longer simply wardens of a POW camp. They were potential witnesses to a war crime. Some of them began to treat the prisoners with greater caution. Others became openly sympathetic. The balance of power inside the wire had shifted, not because the prisoners had gained any physical advantage, but because the moral ground beneath the German position had collapsed. The regime had meant to project strength. Instead, it had revealed desperation. A government that kills unarmed prisoners to discourage escape is not a government in control. It is a government that has run out of answers. And the men behind the wire could see that clearly, even if Berlin could not. The tunnel had done more damage than Bushel ever imagined, not by getting men out, but by provoking a response so disproportionate, so transparently criminal, that it stripped away whatever legitimacy the German treatment of prisoners still possessed. In the months that followed the murders, the war itself began to close around Germany. June 1944 brought the Allied landings in Normandy. The second front that Hitler had feared, and that the German military had spent years preparing for, was now a reality. Allied armies pushed inland from the beaches. Paris was liberated in August. The Soviet advance from the east continued its grinding, unstoppable progress. By autumn, the Reich was fighting on two fronts with diminishing resources, shrinking territory, and a population that was beginning to understand what defeat would look like. Inside the POW camps, the prisoners felt the shift. Red Cross parcels became less regular as supply lines were disrupted. The guards grew older, thinner, more distracted. Rumors filtered through from new arrivals, from smuggled radio broadcasts from the guards themselves, who were increasingly willing to talk. The war was being lost. Everyone knew it. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but when, and what would happen to the millions of men held behind wire when it did. For the men at Stalag Luft III, the memory of the 50 was never far from the surface. The memorial stood in the compound. The urns were there. The names were spoken in quiet moments, passed between men who had known them, kept alive in a way that no German order could suppress. And as the war turned, the memory took on a new dimension. It was no longer just grief, it was evidence. The execution of the 50 had been intended as a closed chapter. The men were dead, the cover story had been filed, the notices had been posted. But the British government had made a public promise, and that promise had not expired. Anthony Eden's words in the House of Commons still hung in the air. Exemplary justice. The phrase was a weapon, and it was pointed at every Gestapo agent, every regional commander, every bureaucrat who had signed a transfer order or typed a false death certificate. As the Allied armies, Advanced, they would eventually reach the places where the murders had occurred. They would find the crematoria records. They would interview the local police. They would trace the teleprints and the transport orders and the chain of command. The German bureaucracy that had enabled the killings had also documented them. Meticulously, precisely, in triplicate. The same efficiency that had made the murders possible would make the prosecution inevitable. And in the camps, the remaining prisoners waited. They waited for liberation. They waited for the gates to open. But they also waited for something else, something that had been promised to them and to the dead. They waited for justice. After Nazi Germany's capitulation in May 1945, the police branch of the Royal Air Force launched an investigation into the killings, having branded the shootings a war crime, despite official German reports that the airmen had been shot while attempting to escape from captivity following recapture. A detachment of the Special Investigation Branch of the Royal Air Force Police, headed by Wing Commander Wilfred Bose, was given the assignment of tracking down the killers of the 50 officers. The investigation started 17 months after the alleged crimes had been committed, making it a cold case. The challenge was immense. Germany was in ruins. Cities had been bombed flat. Millions of people were displaced. Government records had been scattered, destroyed, or hidden. And the men they were looking for belonged to an organization that had specialized in deception. The perpetrators belonged to a body, the secret state police or Gestapo, which held and exercised every facility to provide its members with false identities and forged identification papers immediately upon being ordered to go on the run at the moment of national surrender. The Gestapo had spent years building the infrastructure of surveillance and control. Now, its members were using that same infrastructure to disappear. The small detachment of investigators, numbering 5 officers and 14 NCOs, remained active for 3 years and identified 72 men as guilty of either murder or conspiracy to murder, of whom 69 were accounted for. 19 men against the wreckage of a continent. They traveled across occupied zones, crossed between Allied jurisdictions, navigated the emerging tensions of the Cold War, and pursued leads through bombed-out cities and displaced persons camps. Despite attempts to cover up the murders during the war, the investigators were aided by such things as Germany's meticulous bookkeeping, such as at various crematoria, as well as willing eyewitness accounts and many confessions among the Gestapo members themselves, who cited that they were only following orders. The crematoria records were devastating. Each body had been processed. Each urn had been logged. The dates, locations, and names matched the sequence of the killings with precision. The bureaucracy had done exactly what bureaucracies do. It had kept records, and those records were now evidence. Many of the Gestapo agents, when found, did not deny their involvement. They described what they had done with a chilling matter-of-factness. They had received orders. They had carried them out. They had stopped the car. They had told the prisoner to relieve himself. They had fired. Some expressed regret. Most did not. Nearly all of them offered the same defense. They had been following orders from above. The investigators traced the chain of command upward, from the men who had pulled the triggers, to the regional Gestapo chiefs who had given the instructions, to the central command in Berlin that had issued the teleprint, to the conference at Berchtesgaden where the decision had been made. Each link in the chain was documented. Each name was recorded. Each connection was verified. The tunnel that had been built in secret beneath Hut 104 was now being reconstructed in a different form. Not in sand and wood and tin cans, in testimony, in documents, in the slow, meticulous work of men who believed that justice was not optional, even in the aftermath of the largest war in history. At the Nuremberg trials of the most senior Nazi war criminals, the indictment called for the general staff of the army and the high command of the German armed forces to be considered criminal organizations. One of the crimes charged was the murder of the 50. The killings were not a footnote. They were presented as evidence of the systematic criminality of the Nazi regime. Uniformed prisoners of war, protected by international convention, had been executed without trial on the personal orders of the head of state. The chain of command ran from Hitler through Himmler and Keitel to the Gestapo agents who had carried out the shootings. Every level of the hierarchy was implicated. Britain's chief prosecutor at the trials, David Maxwell Fyfe, was able to prove that Reichsmarschall Göring and General Staff Chief Wilhelm Keitel had been present at a conference 2 days after the escape, where the decision to order the murders was taken. Both men were sentenced to death for this and for numerous other war crimes. The connection between the conference at Berchtesgaden and the roadside killings across Europe had been established beyond doubt. The order had been given. The order had been obeyed. And the consequences of that obedience were now being measured in a courtroom, under lights, with the world watching. In July 1947, a special war crimes court met in Hamburg to put on trial those responsible for the murder of 50 Allied airmen involved in the Great Escape. In 1947, a military tribunal found 18 Nazis guilty of war crimes for shooting the recaptured prisoners of war, and 13 of them were executed. Of those identified, 21 were eventually tried and executed. 17 were tried and imprisoned. 11 had committed suicide. 7 were untraced, although 4 of these were presumed dead. 6 had been killed during the war. 5 were arrested but not charged, and 1 remained in refuge in East Germany. The accounting was exhaustive. The RAF. Investigators had spent 3 years assembling it, and the trials that followed were among the most thorough war crimes proceedings of the post-war period. Not because the numbers were the largest, 50 dead, in a war that killed tens of millions, but because the crime was so clear, the evidence so precise, and the principle so fundamental. If a government can execute prisoners of war without trial, then the Geneva Convention is meaningless. If the convention is meaningless, then there are no rules, and if there are no rules, then war becomes something that no civilization can survive. The trials at Hamburg were not only about punishing the men who pulled the triggers. They were about establishing that there are things a state cannot do, even in wartime. That the uniform a prisoner wears still carries legal meaning. That an order from a head of state does not override the obligations of international law. That the defense of following orders is not a defense at all. The 50 dead, officers of Stalag Luft III, never stood in that courtroom, but their names were spoken there, and the judgment rendered in their name established a precedent that would echo through every war crimes tribunal that followed. The Great Escape entered legend through a Hollywood film, through books, through the quiet persistence of memory. The 1963 movie gave the story its popular shape: the motorcycle, the baseball, the tunnels, the camaraderie. The image of defiant men outwitting their captors in a sunlit camp surrounded by pine trees. It is a good story. It is also an incomplete one. The real story is not the tunnel. The real story is what happened after the tunnel. 76 men crawled through 300 feet of sand and emerged into the freezing night. They carried forged papers and wore stolen clothes and navigated by compasses built from gramophone needles and razor blades. They scattered across a continent at war. 3 of them made it to freedom. The rest were caught. And 50 of those men were murdered in cold blood, on roadsides and in fields, by agents of a state that had decided the rules of war no longer applied to its embarrassment. The tunnel was the provocation. The murders were the response. And the response revealed more about the regime than any intelligence report or battlefield defeat ever could. A government that executes unarmed prisoners because a tunnel humiliated its security apparatus is not acting from strength. It is acting from fear. The order to kill 50 men was not a military decision. It was a psychological one. It was an admission that the appearance of control mattered more than the law, that the ego of leadership mattered more than the lives of captive officers, that the only answer to humiliation was violence so extreme it could not be rationalized, only enforced. Bushel died on the 29th of March 1944, murdered on the explicit instructions of Adolf Hitler. He was 33 years old, a barrister, a skier, a pilot, a man who had escaped twice before, and whose hatred of the Nazi regime had been forged in Gestapo interrogation rooms and in the knowledge that the Czech family who had sheltered him had been executed for their kindness. He never saw the end of the war. He never knew that his escape would provoke a crime so egregious that it would be cited at Nuremberg. He never knew that RAF investigators would spend 3 years tracking down the men who killed him and his comrades. He never knew that the tunnel he built beneath Hut 104 would become the most famous escape route in military history. But he might have understood the paradox. The tunnel did not defeat Germany. It embarrassed Germany. And the embarrassment triggered a response that defeated Germany in a different way, a moral way, a legal way, a way that would be measured in courtrooms rather than on battlefields. The 50 urns that returned to Stalag Luft III were meant to silence resistance. Instead, they amplified it. Every name on that list became a promise. Every urn became evidence. And every Gestapo agent who fired a pistol into the back of a handcuffed officer became a defendant in a trial that the regime never expected to face. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in war is not firepower. It is not technology. It is not strategy. It is humiliation. A tunnel made of bedboards and tin cans and stolen wire, dug by men with nothing but time and rage, and the refusal to accept that their war was over, forced the most powerful dictatorship in Europe to abandon the laws of war and commit a crime that would be prosecuted for decades. The ground above that tunnel is quiet now. The pine forest still stands around the site near Żegen in modern Poland. The huts are gone. The wire is gone. The watchtowers are gone. But the tunnel is still there, sealed and silent, 30 feet beneath the surface. And the names of the 50 are still spoken. Not in anger, not in triumph, in remembrance. Because the story of the Great Escape is not, in the end, a story about getting out. It is a story about what a regime will do when the men it holds captive prove they cannot be controlled, and what the world will do when the war is over to hold that regime accountable for the answer it gave.